Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2 Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip: manage your handouts. We see this often in a lot of presentations, and I'm sure you've seen it as often as I have. An audience comes into the room and sits down. Then the presenter starts to introduce themselves and talk about what they're going to be talking about today, or gives a brief bio or some other introductory material while they start passing out a bunch of handouts or printouts of their slides. While the speaker is now moving on into their introduction and an overview of their content, the room is filled with the sound of shuffling paper, and everybody puts their heads down and starts reading stuff. It doesn't have to be this way. Instead of handing everything out at the beginning, hand out the material when the audience will actually need the material. At that point, in the middle of your presentation, you can say, take a few moments to look over this sheet. And then you can actually step your audience through the content so they have some context for what they are looking at. And they are looking at that material when it is relevant to the points that you are making. For reference or appendix material that they might want to review later, you don't even need to pass that out during the session. You can let them pick up that material as they leave the room, or better yet, you can even offer to send an electronic version of any reference material after the presentation to the attendees. Or, as part of one of your last slides, you can even put a link up on the screen that they can then capture with their cell phones, and then they can go and visit that themselves to go ahead and download that additional reference material. When you manage your handouts well, they become a real asset to your presentation. If you just hand them all out at once at the beginning, they don't become an asset, they become a distraction. Stick around, and after the break, we are going to talk about 12 tips to more successful webinars. Welcome back to one of the most tip-heavy episodes of 2 Minute Talk Tips. For today's post-tip discussion, we're going to talk about 12 tips for a successful webinar. A few years ago, I hosted a webinar for one of the salespeople at my employer. We were introducing a new program to a bunch of our channel partners. And while I was getting ready to start, I flipped through a bunch of features on the platform since it was relatively new. And it's at that point that I learned our sales rep liked to join early morning webinars in her big fluffy robe. I learned this because I inadvertently turned on her webcam from 1,000 miles away. Today's webinar software is a lot more sophisticated than that and has much better privacy features, so accidents like that shouldn't happen. The problems speakers are now most likely to encounter during a webinar are around listener distraction or connectivity issues or even just the nature of being an isolated speaker. Today, I'm going to talk about 12 different tips to address some of those issues and make you a more effective webinar host. But first, what is a webinar? Microsoft Word keeps telling me I should replace the word webinar with online seminar. And that's essentially what it is. A webinar is an online presentation. The speaker and the audience can be spread out around the globe and all connect to each other through the internet or even just through a phone line. They might use a web browser, a standalone application, or some combination of the two, or perhaps even one of them old-fashioned telephone things. A speaker uses the webinar platform as a virtual conference room. They can show slides to everyone. They can share a specific application like a spreadsheet or web browser. They can share their entire desktop if they want. They can give control of applications to a co-presenter or to an audience member. They can interact with the audience via a chat room or the audio conference line. They can even go ahead and record that session to share it with the attendees later or to send it out to any attendees who couldn't actually make it. Some of the most popular webinar platforms out there that you may have heard of include WebEx, GoToMeeting, Skype for Business, Adobe Connect, and there are really a whole bunch more. The advantage of a webinar is that the speaker and the attendees don't actually have to go anywhere. This saves time, it saves money, and it saves effort. The disadvantage, though, is that they're generally less effective than in person meetings or presentations. Now, the drop off in effectiveness is going to vary widely with the presenter, with the audience, and with the subject matter. And many times it's a perfectly reasonable trade off for the savings of time, money, and effort, but it is still a trade off. The software is also more complicated than just using presentation software in a conference room and plugging into a projector. The speaker will also get virtually zero nonverbal feedback from the audience, and the audience is more likely to be multitasking and getting distracted during a webinar. I think most of us have probably been on a webinar at some point or some other online training program and had our email open in another window on another monitor, getting other stuff done while we were supposed to be giving our full attention to the webinar. That said, webinars are here to stay. And there are some potentially really exciting things happening in this space. New technologies in virtual reality or augmented reality really have tremendous potential to revolutionize telepresence. Until that happens, though, we're stuck with our current platforms that we have today. And here are 12 tips to make them more effective. Those 12 tips are: first, choose a quiet, distraction-free environment. 2, check the background. 3, stop streaming other stuff. 4, know your software. 5, streamline your slide deck. 6, disable background tasks. 7, arrive early. 8, use a welcome screen. 9, use a USB webcam. 10, use an external microphone. 11, use the annotation tools. And 12, work with a partner. Let's take a deeper look at each of these tips now. 1, choose a quiet, distraction-free environment. If you work in a cubicle, a cube farm, an open office, or something, an environment like that, book a conference room for the webinar that you're going to host. If you have a private office, go ahead and close the door. If you work from home and you're going to be hosting a webinar, lock up the pets and lock up the children. Close any patio doors and windows near where you'll be speaking. You want to focus on the webinar and not the things interfering with the webinar. Number 2, check the background. It's important to understand what the audience will see when you turn on your camera. Is there clutter in your space? Is there confidential information scrawled on that whiteboard just over your shoulder? Photographers often follow what's called the rule of thirds when composing their shots, and this is a great tool for evaluating the background on your web camera. Mentally divide the image from your camera into 3 vertical sections and 3 horizontal sections. And now you've got 9 different squares you can think about, like when you're playing tic-tac-toe or watching the Hollywood Squares. Look at each of those 9 squares and decide if there's something in the background you need to move or you need to obscure. If you need to obscure the space, a projection screen is a clean, simple way to do that. You can even do something as simple as hang a bed sheet up there or set up some other sort of screen or way of blocking things you don't want to show. The only things the audience should be seeing in the background are the things that you want the audience to see. Number 3, stop streaming other stuff. This applies mostly to those who are hosting a webinar from their home or remote office. Because it's important to preserve the bandwidth or the internet speed on your network and dedicate it to the webinar software, ask other members of your household not to use things like Netflix, Spotify, Hulu, Xbox Online Gaming, or other streaming or gaming services while you are hosting your webinar. Depending on your network infrastructure, those things can have a major impact on your webinar performance. And as you're hosting your webinar, you don't want to have to compete for bandwidth with the newest season of Fuller House. Number 4, know your software. Part of your prep work should be to practice with the tool. Know how to show and how to stop showing your slides. Know how to show and how to hide your desktop. Know how to mute or unmute your audience members. Know how to pass control to another user and how to take control back. Know how to turn your camera and your microphone on and off. And really just know the other features of your tool. If you're new to this particular tool, schedule a practice session with a colleague to get a feel for how the different features work and how they look. Make all of your mistakes in practice so you don't make them in an actual webinar and so you don't inadvertently turn on the wrong person's web camera. Number 5, streamline your deck. Webinars require not only more network bandwidth, but also more computer processing power than simply presenting in a conference room. That nifty, smooth, cool-looking animation you spent all that time on to craft that looks awesome in the conference room is going to look jumpy on the webinar. Colors may be washed out, layouts may be compressed, and I have never seen a video play well in a webinar. As you go through your slide deck for your webinar, eliminate most of the animations, the transitions between slides, the slides that build, any videos that are embedded in there, and other multimedia material. That stuff probably is just not going to look good in the webinar. Number 6, disable background tasks. Turn off things like antivirus, cloud storage syncing, automatic backups, email pop-ups, instant messaging apps, and other things like that, the things that run in the background while you're doing other stuff. The main reason to turn off most of this stuff is that you want to reserve system performance for the webinar software. You also want to preserve network bandwidth. When it comes to instant messaging apps or email pop-ups, you definitely want to turn those off before sharing your desktop in the webinar. You probably don't want to broadcast a surprise racy message from your significant other or a sensitive customer question from your boss to the entire audience. Number 7, arrive early. If you're the host, you should probably be the first one to log into the webinar. For most webinars I host, I like to be about 20 minutes early. This gives me the opportunity to address any issues that come up. Plus, some services won't let the audience connect until the host connects, and I prefer to not leave my audience members in a virtual lobby. Number 8, use a welcome screen. When attendees arrive, you want them to be comfortable that they are in the right space, especially if they had any trouble getting connected and set up, or if they're new to webinars in general. Your welcome screen confirms that they are just where they need to be, and it tells them when you'll get started. As folks start to join, I also like to jump in on the audio every few minutes to welcome them and to confirm that we will start in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Number 9, use a USB webcam. To show your image and your video, you need a web camera, and the one built into your laptop just won't cut it. It's probably lower quality, and it's in a spot that is both inconvenient and unflattering. With a USB webcam, you can deliberately place it to show you at your best angle with your best lighting without slouching. Number 10, use an external microphone. Few things in a webinar are more annoying than poor audio. Use an external device like a USB headset or other separate mic. One that is focused directly on your voice will pick up less room noise and less echo. If your audio is poor, you'll alienate your audience in no time. Number 11, use the annotation tools. Most webinar platforms will have annotation tools like virtual highlighters, arrows, virtual laser pointers, virtual pens, and other tools. You can use these tools to mark up your slides while you speak and to direct your audience's attention to specific items on the screen. And it's important that you do this. In a live presentation where you've got the people physically right in front of you, you can use your gestures, your placement in the room, your pacing, and other nonverbal communication techniques to focus the audience's attention. In a webinar, you don't have that. You have to use your annotation tools to engage your audience visually. You need to have that motion on the screen so your audience doesn't completely drift away. And finally, number 12, use a partner. One of the great things about a webinar platform is the chat room. Attendees can type questions and comments in there while you're speaking. The problem is that to manage the chat room and respond to questions, you have to stop speaking, break your stride, read the chat, formulate your answer, and get back to your content. It ends up leaving a lot of silence, messes up your rhythm, and it's just not effective. Instead, ask a colleague to join you. That colleague can monitor the chat room while you're speaking. If they are also a subject matter expert, they can answer questions for the audience members and respond to those comments by typing answers in that chat room while you're continuing with your presentation. They can also go ahead and curate those questions and represent the chat room in a Q&A if that's how you choose to run things. And then you can have a live dialogue between yourself and your colleague as they ask questions and you provide the answers. Working with a partner will make it more effective and a lot more fun. So that's it. 12 tips to run a more effective webinar. Choose a quiet, distraction-free environment. Check the background. Stop streaming other stuff. Know your software. Streamline your slide deck. Disable background tasks. Arrive early. Use a welcome screen. Use a USB webcam. Use an external microphone. Use the annotation tools. And work with a partner. What tips or questions do you have about running a webinar? Go ahead and tell us in the comments for episode 14 at 2minutetalktips.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or review in the iTunes podcast store and subscribe to 2 Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast application. Until next week, practice your webinars, manage your handouts, and don't get best, get better.